There are growing calls for an inquiry to be held into press freedom in the wake of police raids on the media last week. We're now joined by journalist Peter Greste. Peter, thanks so much for your time. I know that you have been overseas and you're probably slightly jet lagged this morning, but surely you were watching on like the rest of us over the last week thinking, what is going on in Australia with press freedom?
Yeah, look, it was pretty shocking to me. I mean, this really sent shivers down my spine. I remember back in 2013 when I was in Egypt and my hotel room was raided by agents from the National Intelligence Directorate in Egypt, and watching the raids unfold here in Australia really recalled those pretty horrible memories. I'm not suggesting that Australia is about to become Egypt anytime soon, but the problem is that what we saw in our case, in Egypt's case, was the way governments were using national security as an excuse to redefine the space that journalists are able to operate in, and then targeting journalists to try and shut down uncomfortable reporting. And in all sorts of ways, I think that's what we saw last week as well.
So, Peter, you said that we're not at risk of, becoming Egypt anytime soon, but I'm just interested in where you see Australia in terms of press freedom. Where do we rank roughly in terms of the laws governing our profession?
Look, not as well as we might like to think. There's a couple of law scholars have been tracking the numbers of national security laws that have been passed since 9/11, and at the moment the tally is up to over 70, more than just about any other country in the Western Hemisphere. And that's, I think, really troubling. A lot of the laws were drafted with perfectly good intentions in mind, aimed to try and give the security agencies the powers that they need to intercept terrorist communications and keep us safer, and I fully understand that. But what has often happened is that the laws have been drafted very loosely indeed. The definitions around the laws have been loosened up, and what that's done in the process is made it incredibly difficult and even dangerous for journalists to maintain contact with sources inside government, and then for those sources to leak information and for journalists to publish them. And at each stage what we've seen is a growing criminalisation of journalism. And that is really pretty troubling. There are a couple of commentators who've argued that Australia is in fact is the most restrictive country in the West, amongst all Western democracies. Again, I'm not going to necessarily say that we're quite at that stage, but the fact remains that we've got laws that make it extraordinarily difficult for journalists to do their jobs.
Yeah, those laws, I mean, it has been pointed out that this law that was used last week was not a new law. So what does it tell you about, I guess, the lag time and how laws are used and the seeming changer in political culture and environment where the AFP can look to use an opportunity, or the lag time even in investigation? Do you think they are all legitimate concerns, legitimate conversations to be had?
Well, there are a few things to unpack here. First of all is that the Crimes Act, which was used in these cases, is a piece of legislation that dates back to 1917. It's a very, very old law indeed. But every time that the AFP carry out an investigation, there is a choice involved. These things aren't automatic. They're not sort of mechanical things. You press a button over here and you end up with the result there. You've got to remember that there have been other leaks from government that haven't been investigated. The leak from Michaelia Cash's office about a raid, an AFP raid on Union Office, was never investigated. And there have been other cases fairly similar to that. And so what we're seeing is, I think, a shifting focus on what the law should be dealing with. We've also seen a lot of laws that have undermined the journalist's capacity to protect sources. The data retention legislation, for example, that makes it possible for the authorities to investigate the metadata of any Australian. They do need a warrant to look into journalist metadata, but those warrants and the warrant applications are all held in secret. And so, again, what we're seeing is a shifting security environment that prioritises national security, that dramatically weakens journalists' capacity to keep their sources secret, to protect their sources. And remember, this is not something that is new. The journalists there have been shield laws in place for many, many years, which give journalists the right to protect their sources in court. Now, those laws are meaningless if we have the federal police that has the power to raid journalists' homes, to investigate, to filter through their undie drawers in a search for evidence that might point to sources. And that's where we're getting the balance wrong.
Peter, we've seen a forceful response from the media, our executives, the head of News Corp in Australia, Michael Miller, the chair of the ABC, Ida Buttrose, met with the Prime Minister yesterday to put her concerns very directly and forcefully to him in Sydney. How important is it, do you think, over the next weeks and months, that the media maintains that strong message on this issue to policymakers?
Yeah, well, I think in that respect we need to be very grateful to the federal police and the government, because they've been able to unite the media in ways that I don't think we've ever seen for a very, very long time. Look, I really do think this is important, that we maintain that kind of sense of unity across the media. And I think we also need to remind Australians that this isn't about protecting the rights of journalists to stick their noses into the guts of government. This is about maintaining the capacity of journalists to hold the government to account on behalf of the public. We need to remind people of how our democracy would look like if all we had to go on for our understanding of what was taking place in government was the Facebook posts and Twitter feeds of our politicians and senior civil servants.
Heaven forbid.
There's not a lot of confidence. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I know that there's a lot of people very cynical about the media, and I understand where that comes from, but you've also got to understand what the alternative looks like. And I remember someone made the point very, very clearly that I was talking to them the other day, and they said, look, the more you increase the power of the government to investigate and the more you increase the security powers of the authorities, the more you actually need to increase the capacity of the journalists to hold that power in check, to stop the kind of overreach that we saw in our case in Egypt.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, devil's advocate here, we are in a new security environment. The risk of terror has been seen right across the Western world, and that's why we have seen so many laws change to keep up with technology, to try and stop would-be terrorists communicating. But where is that line, Peter? I mean, it's a difficult line to identify, isn't it?
Well, I'm not sure that it is that difficult. Look, in each of the cases, and let me be absolutely clear, I am not suggesting that we need to repeal all of these pieces of national security legislation. This is not about undoing all of these critical laws. We do need to update our laws to deal with ongoing and developing terror threats. This is about striking an appropriate balance between national security and media oversight. What we have at the moment is a public interest defence. That means that when the authorities carry out these kinds of raids, they haul journalists and sources before the courts, we then have the opportunity to say, no, this reporting is in the public interest, and therefore we need to be allowed to continue this. That's too late. That doesn't help us. That's massively intimidating to sources. It makes it incredibly difficult for journalists to operate. What we need is an exception. What we need is to place the onus on the authorities to demonstrate why that public interest defence should not apply. We need to place the onus on the authorities to prove that there is a risk, a genuine threat to national security. And if you can't demonstrate that risk, if there is reporting that is genuinely in the public interest, then that needs to go ahead. We're not the first country in the world to do this. The United Kingdom requires the authorities to demonstrate before a senior judge or a senior judge that there is a genuine threat to national security. And then they're not allowed to look for the source. They can simply go to the journalist to investigate the information they have available to them. And I think that's a more appropriate balance.
Peter, thanks so much for your time this morning. Really good to see you, and sleep in sunshine for a jet lag, Peter Greste, I would suggest.